2020 was really bad. For most Americans, it was the worst year in living memory, and for good reasons. 342,000 deaths, and counting, an economy that cratered, high unemployment, and social isolation. It's a year that few will miss as we move into 2021. But if we expand the time horizon and look back in history, we can see just how bad things could have been. Our ancestors had it worse. The 1918-1919 influenza epidemic was worse. Many Americans have had a quick history lesson on influenza epidemics, but it's worth recounting just how bad that earlier influenza was. Like COVID-19, it had 3 waves: March to July 1918, September to November 1918, winter-spring 1919. In all, 675,000 Americans died out of a population that was then 105 million. Today it is 330 million. That's a death rate 6 times what we have experienced with COVID-19. There was no vaccine in 1918-1919. The pandemic continued until it had burned through the whole population. What made the 1918-1919 epidemic particularly tragic was that it struck young people hardest, unlike the present epidemic, which is hitting the elderly hardest. The reasons are not clear. Perhaps older people had some residual resistance from earlier attacks. The epidemic was so bad it temporarily lowered U.S. life expectancy by 12 years. With the current epidemic, it's tragic to lose a 75-year-old grandparent, but that person had a much shorter life expectancy than a 25-year-old. Thus, in terms of life years lost, that earlier epidemic had a far greater impact. The pandemic also occurred during and immediately after a world war, with all the uncertainty and destruction that such a conflict entails. Americans of that era could not shelter in place. There was a war to be won. The Great Depression of 1929 was worse. As with the COVID-19 pandemic, the crash of 1929 caused a reduction of employment as economic activity slowed. Unemployment rose to 25% by 1933. Further, the Depression lasted into the late 1930s, essentially a full decade. It did not ease until war contracts began arriving in 1938 and did not fully go away until the United States converted to a war economy. Today unemployment is about 6.7% after peaking at 15% in April. The economy is down, but government action has propped it up. There is every prospect that by this time next year, economic activity will return to something like normal. We are in a far better situation than what our grandparents and great-grandparents had to endure. What to be thankful for? 2 vaccines are now being administered, and more are on the way. The end of the pandemic may not be quite in sight, but we can be confident that there will be an end. Beyond that, we can be thankful for peace and prosperity. It is hard to think of the world as peaceful, with many reports of conflict around the world and U.S. forces still engaged in combat in the Middle East, but it is. Violence never will go away, but the level of global violence today is relatively low.